Screams in the night. The night was thick with fog, swirling around the narrow, winding roads of Ravenshade, a small, isolated village buried deep within the mountains. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the dense forest that surrounded the town. The air was damp, carrying with it the scent of moss and decay. The village itself had been the subject of countless whispered legends, a place where shadows moved on their own and voices called out in the dark. But the most chilling tale of all was the one of the screams, agonized, heart-wrenching cries that echoed through the valley at the stroke of midnight. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Jonathan Crow was a journalist known for his investigations into the paranormal. He had spent years debunking ghost stories and exposing frauds, but something about the legends of Ravenshade intrigued him. Unlike other ghost towns, the reports here were consistent, the witnesses terrified beyond reason. No one had ever been able to explain the origin of the screams, and no one who tried had ever returned with answers. He arrived in town just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The village was eerily silent, the townsfolk retreating into their homes as darkness fell. The few he managed to speak to were reluctant to discuss the screams, their eyes filled with fear. Some merely muttered prayers under their breath before shutting their doors. Jonathan found lodging at the Hollow Inn, a decrepit building with creaking floorboards and dim lighting. The innkeeper, a frail woman named Agnes, warned him, "Leave before midnight. Do not listen. Do not go outside." Her bony fingers gripped his wrist with unexpected strength, her eyes clouded with something between fear and sorrow. Chapter 2. The First Night. Determined to uncover the truth, Jonathan set up his recording equipment near his window and waited. As the clock struck 12, a distant wail pierced the silence. It was unlike anything he had ever heard. Raw, desperate, filled with unthinkable agony. The sound seemed to come from the forest beyond the village. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The village was deathly still, yet the scream persisted, growing louder as he approached the tree line. The cold air bit at his skin as he ventured deeper into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches twisting like claws. Then silence. The sudden absence of sound sent a chill down his spine. Jonathan turned to leave, but a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure stood among the trees, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured. The figure let out a guttural, inhuman shriek, and before Jonathan could react, he was sent tumbling to the ground by an unseen force. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. As he reached the village, he caught sight of something horrifying. Shadowy figures lingering near the houses, their eyes glowing like embers. They turned toward him in unison before vanishing into the darkness. When he burst into his room at the Hollow Inn, he locked the door behind him, his hands trembling. His recording device continued to run, capturing the last remnants of the unholy scream. Chapter 3. The Village's Secret. The next morning, Jonathan played back the recording. The scream was there, but beneath it, he could hear something else, whispering. A chorus of voices muttered in an ancient tongue, layered beneath the agony. When he slowed the audio, the whispers turned into words. Blood must be repaid. The cursed never rest. Determined to find answers, he sought out the oldest resident of Ravenshade, Father Ellison, the town's priest. The old man initially refused to speak, but after much persuasion, he relented. "This town carries a curse, Mr. Crow," he said gravely. "Many years ago, a terrible injustice was committed. A woman, accused of witchcraft, was burned at the stake where the forest now stands. She cursed the land with her dying breath. Every night, she screams, seeking vengeance." Jonathan was skeptical, but the fear in the priest's eyes was genuine. "How do you stop it?" he asked. Father Ellison sighed. "We don't. Those who tried never returned." Chapter 4. the descent. That night, Jonathan made his decision. He would go back to the forest. He armed himself with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a protective charm given to him by Father Ellison. The priest had warned him that the spirits of the damned did not take kindly to intruders. The screams began again at midnight, but this time, Jonathan did not hesitate. He pushed forward deeper into the trees, the air growing heavier with each step. He could feel eyes watching him, unseen figures lurking just beyond his vision. The ground beneath his feet turned to something soft and wet. When he aimed his flashlight down, he recoiled in horror. He had stepped into a pit of rotting skeletal remains. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes staring up at him, as if frozen in eternal suffering. Then he saw it, a clearing in the woods where a blackened stake stood in the center. The ground was scorched, as if the fire from centuries ago had never faded. As he approached, the temperature dropped drastically, his breath visible in the air. A figure emerged from the darkness. The woman's face was gaunt, her eyes hollow voids, her mouth twisted into an eternal scream, her body flickering between solid and spectral. Jonathan felt his body lock in place as a force gripped him, pulling him toward her. The trees around him trembled, as if alive, their bark splitting open to reveal rotten flesh underneath. Blackened hands burst from the ground, skeletal fingers clawing at his legs. A ghastly chorus of voices shrieked in unison, their words merging into an unintelligible cacophony. The woman's face twisted and split, revealing a mouth filled with writhing tongues, each whispering curses meant to drive him mad. She whispered, her voice layered with many others. "Do you feel their pain? Will you join them?" Jonathan gasped, struggling against the invisible grip. He realized then that the curse was not just a story, it was real, and it would consume him. Chapter 5, The Escape. With the last ounce of strength he had, Jonathan ripped the protective charm from his neck and held it high. A burst of light erupted, and the entity recoiled, its wail reaching an ear-splitting crescendo. The force holding him shattered, and he stumbled backward, barely able to breathe. He ran, the trees blurring past him, the screams following close behind. As he broke free of the forest, the noise ceased, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing. He did not stop running until he reached his car. Without looking back, he drove away from Raven Shade, vowing never to return. Epilogue. Jonathan published his findings, but no one believed him. The recording he made was nothing but static. The footage was corrupted. The village of Raven Shade was wiped from maps, as if it never existed. Yet, on some nights, if one listens closely near the mountains, the screams can still be heard, echoing through the valleys, a reminder of the curse that refuses to be forgotten. Months later, Jonathan began to hear whispers in his own home. Shadows moved when no one was there. And one night, as he played back the corrupted footage, his screen flickered. The woman's face appeared. A piercing scream erupted from his speakers. And then, darkness. The Ancient Curse. Part 1. The Arrival of the Curse. The small village of Everbrook had long been untouched by time. Nestled deep within the forests, it was a place where life moved slowly, and every stone, every tree, seemed to hold a story passed down through generations. But beneath the surface of this serene existence, an ancient evil slumbered. It began when a group of archaeologists arrived in Everbrook, led by Dr. Edward Hawthorne, a scholar of ancient civilizations. They had heard rumors of an old, forgotten temple hidden deep within the woods. A temple believed to be cursed by the villagers who had lived there for centuries. The villagers, still gripped by their ancestors' fears, warned the group to stay away, but the archaeologists were undeterred. Driven by the pursuit of knowledge and discovery, they ventured into the forest, determined to find the temple and uncover its secrets. As the group delved deeper into the forest, the air grew thicker, and the sunlight barely pierced through the dense canopy. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. They eventually found the temple, its stone walls covered in moss and inscriptions in an ancient language none of them could decipher. But one inscription, in particular, caught Dr. Hawthorne's attention. It was a warning, written in a language he had never seen before. The words were an omen, a curse. Those who awaken the ancient evil shall be bound to its will, and they shall know no rest until the end of days. The archaeologists, dismissing the villagers' warnings as mere superstition, began their excavation. They pried open the temple's entrance, unaware that they were unleashing something far darker than they could have imagined. Part 2. The Curse Unleashed. As they entered the temple, the air inside was cold, stale, and thick with the scent of age. Strange symbols adorned the walls, depicting creatures of the night, beasts that looked like twisted, half-human forms, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as though something was waiting for them, something ancient and malevolent. Dr. Hawthorne and his team discovered an altar at the center of the temple, covered in dust and cobwebs. Atop the altar lay a small, intricately carved stone, a relic perhaps from another time. As Hawthorne reached out to touch the stone, a low growl echoed through the temple. The ground beneath them trembled, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the very structure of the temple was alive, reacting to their presence. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, a blinding light erupted from it, and the ground shook violently. The archaeologists were thrown to the floor, and a terrible voice, deep and guttural, filled the air. "Fools, you have awakened me." Part 3. The Consequences of Ignorance. The curse was real. The ancient evil had been bound to the temple for centuries, sealed away by the villagers' ancestors to protect them from its wrath. Now that it had been freed, its thirst for vengeance could not be quenched. The very land itself seemed to writhe in agony as the curse spread across the village of Everbrook. That night, strange things began to happen. The villagers reported seeing figures moving in the shadows, their faces pale and twisted. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, voices calling their names in the dead of night. Others disappeared without a trace, only to be found later, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder. Dr. Hawthorne and his team soon realized the true extent of their mistake. They had not just awakened the curse, they had become its prisoners. The evil force now bound them to the land, and its influence began to take hold of their minds. The archaeologists began to see things that weren't there, shadowy figures lurking at the corners of their vision, distant cries that echoed in their ears. As the days passed, their sanity began to fray, one thread at a time. Part 4. Descent into Madness. The curse did not discriminate. One by one, the archaeologists were driven to madness by the visions and whispers. Dr. Hawthorne, once a man of reason and logic, found himself struggling to retain control over his own mind. He became obsessed with the idea that there was a way to reverse the curse, to seal the evil back within the temple. But with every passing day, the curse grew stronger, and his grip on reality slipped further. Meanwhile, the village of Everbrook descended into chaos. The once peaceful inhabitants were now plagued by nightmares, their homes overrun by monstrous creatures that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. The villagers began to flee, abandoning their homes in the face of the relentless terror. Dr. Hawthorne's obsession with the stone grew, until one night he could no longer resist its pull. He returned to the temple, determined to find a way to end the curse. But what he discovered, there was more horrifying than anything he could have imagined. Part 5. The Truth Revealed. In the heart of the temple, Dr. Hawthorne uncovered a hidden chamber, its walls covered in blood-stained symbols. At the center of the room lay a grotesque figure, its form twisted and corrupted by centuries of imprisonment. It was not a god, as the archaeologists had once thought, but a creature of pure malevolence, a being that fed on fear and suffering. The curse had been placed upon this creature, trapping it within the temple to prevent it from spreading its influence across the world. But now, freed from its prison, it sought only one thing: to consume everything in its path. Dr. Hawthorne realized that the creature had not been sealed away by the villagers. It had been contained, its power bound by ancient rituals. But with the destruction of the altar, the bindings were broken and the creature was free. In his final moments, Dr. Hawthorne understood the true nature of the curse. It was not just a force of evil. It was a parasite feeding off the minds of those it touched, warping their thoughts and driving them to madness. And now, it would consume everything, starting with him. Part 6, the end of Everbrook. As the creature emerged from the temple, its form shifting and writhing, the village of Everbrook was swallowed by darkness. The last remnants of the cursed village were erased from existence, consumed by the very evil that had once been sealed away. The curse of Everbrook lived on, spreading to new lands, seeking out new victims. And though the village had been lost to time, its story remained, a warning to those who would dare to awaken what should remain undisturbed. Part 7, the final awakening. The village of Everbrook was no more. Its houses lay in ruins, consumed by darkness and madness. The land itself was twisted, as though it had been bent and reshaped by an invisible, malevolent force. There is no sign of life, only the lingering echoes of suffering and despair. The curse had claimed everything, and now it was beginning to spread beyond the village. Dr. Hawthorne, now completely broken, wandered through the desolate streets of the village. His mind was fractured, pieces of his sanity shattered by the horrors he had witnessed. He had sought to understand the curse, to find a way to reverse it, but now he understood that there was no escape. The curse was not just a force. It was a presence, a living thing, bound to this world by the suffering of those it had consumed. As he stumbled toward the ruins of the temple, the ground beneath him began to tremble once more. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror, as the sky above him darkened, the sun completely blotted out by thick, swirling clouds. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the depths of the earth, and the ground cracked open, releasing a foul, putrid stench. The very air felt wrong, as though it was alive with malice. Dr. Hawthorne fell to his knees, his body trembling as the temple doors creaked open once more. But this time, it was not the stone altar or the dark presence within that called to him. It was something far worse, something far more ancient. From the depths of the temple, a figure emerged. It was not the creature he had seen before, but something far more horrifying. This being was the embodiment of the curse itself, a twisted, writhing mass of flesh, bone, and shadow. Its body shifted and morphed, parts of it crawling over one another like wriggling maggots, while other sections were vast, gaping holes that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Its face was an ever-changing horror, with eyes that were not eyes, but endless black voids, constantly moving and shifting. As it stepped into the open, the ground cracked beneath its feet, as though the earth itself could not bear its weight. The air grew thick with a sense of finality, a crushing weight that pressed down on Dr. Hawthorne's chest. Finally, the creature's voice boomed, not in words, but in thoughts, in a deep, resonating hum that vibrated through his skull. "You have freed me, and now you will join me." The ground beneath him split open, and tendrils of darkness shot up from the earth, wrapping around his body. He screamed as they constricted, pulling him toward the creature. His body twisted and contorted as the tendrils burrowed into his skin, ripping him apart from the inside out. His vision blurred, and in the final moments of consciousness, he saw the villagers' faces, twisted, corrupted, their bodies fused with the cursed land, their souls forever trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The creature's form towered above him, its hunger insatiable. It opened its mouth, its gaping maw, and as it did, the earth trembled violently. The sky cracked open, unleashing a storm of black, suffocating clouds that poured down upon the village, consuming everything in their path. From the ground, a cacophony of screams erupted, not from the creature, but from the very land itself. It was as though the earth had become a living entity, screaming in agony as the curse spread across the world. The land, once fertile and green, withered and rotted, turning into a barren wasteland where nothing could grow, nothing could live. As Dr. Hawthorne's body was torn apart by the tendrils, his mind was flooded with visions of past and future, of those who would come before and those who would come after. He saw the curse spreading, leeching its way into every corner of the world, feeding on the terror and suffering of all who dared to enter its domain. But the worst vision came last, the one that shattered his already broken mind. He saw himself, Dr. Hawthorne, or what was left of him, rising again from the depths of the temple, not as a man, but as something worse. His body had been twisted beyond recognition, a puppet of the curse, his mind lost to the darkness. He was now a part of the creature, bound to it for all eternity, feeding on the suffering of others, forever trapped in a cycle of death and rebirth. And then the final blow came. The creature, in all its monstrous glory, opened its gaping mouth wide, swallowing everything in its path. The world was consumed by darkness, by hunger, by an ancient evil that would never die. Epilogue, the legacy of the curse. Years passed, and the village of Everbrook was forgotten, swallowed by the land, erased from all maps and records. The curse, however, did not fade. It continued to spread, slowly at first, like a dark shadow creeping across the world. Those who dared to venture too close to the place where Everbrook once stood were never seen again. Whispers of the cursed village and the ancient evil that lay beneath it haunted the stories told in every corner of the world. And in the darkest, most forgotten corners of the earth, the creature waited, its hunger never satisfied, its curse never ending. Those who dared to seek the temple, or even to speak its name, would find themselves drawn into its grasp, never to return. For as long as fear exists in the hearts of mankind, the curse of Everbrook will remain, an ancient evil that feeds on suffering, that thrives on terror, and that will never, ever be forgotten. Night of horror. The moon hung high in the ink-black sky, casting eerie silver light over the desolate countryside. A cold wind rustled the brittle leaves, whispering secrets only the dead could understand. A lone figure, Sarah, drove down the narrow road that sliced through the dense forest. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she glanced at the fuel gauge, almost empty. She had been driving for hours, desperate to escape the suffocating city life, yearning for the tranquility of the countryside. But tranquility was the last thing she felt as the road seemed endless, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Suddenly, the engine sputtered. With a final choking gasp, the car rolled to a stop. Sarah's heart hammered as she turned the key, but the engine refused to come back to life. She let out a frustrated sigh, grabbing her phone. No signal. Stepping out, the air felt unnaturally cold, thick with something unexplainable. She glanced around. The only source of light was the dim glow of the moon. In the distance, she spotted a faint light flickering between the trees. "A house," she whispered, hope creeping in her voice. She had no other choice. Wrapping her coat tightly around herself, she started toward it. The path was treacherous, twisted roots clawing at her ankles, the ground uneven. Each step felt heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching. The deeper she walked, the more unnatural the forest became. trees twisted at impossible angles, their bark resembling grotesque, screaming faces. Low-hanging branches curled toward her like skeletal fingers. A putrid stench filled the air, making her stomach churn. Somewhere in the distance, something rustled. Sarah froze. The sound didn't belong to the wind. It was deliberate, calculated. A heavy breathing, raspy and wet, echoed through the trees. Then came the snap of a twig, closer this time. She broke into a run. The underbrush clawed at her legs as she stumbled forward. Shadows moved at the edge of her vision, shapes too large to be animals, too twisted to be human. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she finally reached the clearing. The house stood in eerie silence, an old Victorian mansion with ivy creeping up its walls. The light she had seen flickered from a window on the second floor. Gathering her courage, she climbed the steps and knocked on the door. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open by itself, revealing a dark hallway. "Hello," she called out, stepping inside. Her voice was swallowed by the void. A grand chandelier hung overhead, its crystals coated in dust. The air smelled of decay, of something rotten and forgotten. Furniture lay covered in white sheets, resembling ghosts frozen in time. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. Sarah turned sharply. Nothing. Her footsteps echoed as she walked deeper into the house, the wooden floorboards groaning under her weight. A large painting hung on the wall, depicting a woman in a black dress, her hollow eyes staring straight ahead. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Then footsteps. She wasn't alone. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silence. She turned to leave, but the door she had entered through was now shut. Panic flared in her chest. She ran toward it, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. A child's giggle echoed through the hallway. Sarah spun around. At the top of the grand staircase stood a little girl in a white nightgown. Her hair fell in tangled curls over her pale face. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, barely above a whisper. The girl tilted her head. "You shouldn't be here." A door slammed somewhere upstairs. A cold dread settled in Sarah's bones. "I just need help," she pleaded. The girl took a step back, disappearing into the shadows. Then the whispers returned, surrounding her, growing louder. A gust of wind howled through the hallway, extinguishing the candlelight. Sarah's breathing grew rapid as she fumbled in the darkness. Something brushed against her shoulder. She screamed. A cold hand clamped over her mouth. A voice rasped in her ear, "Run." Terror propelled her forward. She bolted up the stairs, following the girl's fading silhouette. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors slamming shut as she passed. Shadows twisted along the walls, contorted faces staring at her with soulless eyes. She reached the end of the corridor, a single door standing before her. Without hesitation, she shoved it open and stumbled inside. The room was eerily pristine, untouched by time. In the center stood a large bed with a canopy of lace. On the nightstand lay an old photograph, a family portrait. Her breath hitched as she recognized one of the figures. The girl. She looked unchanged, her eyes hauntingly familiar. But the date on the photograph was from a century ago. A whisper tickled her ear. "You shouldn't have come." The door slammed shut behind her. The light flickered. Shadows slithered toward her, growing taller, darker. The whispers turned to agonized screams. Sarah turned, but her body froze in terror. The walls were bleeding, thick, dark liquid oozing down like living veins. The air filled with the stench of rotting flesh. A grotesque figure emerged from the shadows. A skeletal woman in a tattered dress, her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Her hollow sockets bled black tears as she reached out with claw-like fingers. "Stay with us." The voices crooned in unison, disembodied and echoing. A gnarled hand gripped Sarah's wrist, ice cold and unrelenting. The little girl appeared again, but her face was decayed, flesh peeling from bone. Her mouth twisted unnaturally as she let out a guttural shriek. Sarah struggled, her screams swallowed by the abyss. Hands erupted from the floor, skeletal fingers wrapping around her ankles, dragging her down into the darkness. Her nails clawed at the wood, but the floorboards cracked open like a gaping maw. The last thing she saw was the woman's hollow eyes staring into her soul. Then, silence. The house stood undisturbed, a relic of the past. The road remained empty. Sarah's car was gone, and so was she. A week later, a search party found her car on the roadside, abandoned. They scoured the forest, calling her name, but she was nowhere to be found. In the mansion, the dust remained undisturbed, the furniture still draped in sheets. But in the grand hallway, a new painting had appeared. It was of Sarah. Her hollow eyes stared out from the frame, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. And in the darkness, the whispers began again.